session, we're going to take a look at the connection between language use and diversity. And by diversity, I'm specifically narrowing it down just to talk about ethnic diversity. The term diversity can be used to describe differences in a lot of different ways, but in this session, we're just going to focus on differences in ethnicity and connect that up with language use choices that people make. In this session, we're going to look at a lot of definitions, so we'll be doing a lot of defining of concepts. We'll define what diversity is, what race is, and what ethnicity is. And we'll compare and contrast race versus ethnicity to make sure that you're clear on these different definitions. We'll look at some more concepts. We'll look at stereotyping, discrimination, and racism. Then we'll look at the intersection of ethnicity and language variation, so how ethnicity gives us language variation. And finally, we'll discuss how to distinguish regional language variation from a sociolect and an ethnolect. So let's get started and dig into these topics. When we're looking at the question of language education and diversity, we have a lot of terms that we have to define in order to make sure that we're actually talking about the same thing when we're using these terms. So the first term we need to look at is the word diversity. Diversity has a very wide general application. It simply means variety. So it could be variety of how people look. So you could have people who look many different ways. You could have variety in height, for example. You could have variety in weight, variety in hair color. So there's a lot of different ways that we can have diversity in a population of people. We can have diversity in intellectual abilities, physical abilities, learning abilities. We can have diversity in terms of professional backgrounds, personal interests, many different things. However, specifically when we're talking about language education and diversity, we really narrow diversity down to talk about diversity of first language background and ethnic background or national background. So we're really looking at the different languages that our language students bring to the table and also the different cultural or ethnic backgrounds that they bring to the table. So when we use the term diversity, this is what we're talking about: diversity of first language background and diversity of ethnic or cultural background. The next term that we need to define in our discussion about language and diversity is the term race. Race is a really interesting concept because its definition and even the validity of it as a concept have really evolved over the years. And it's almost evolved to the point where we no longer believe in the concept of race. But it really is an interesting concept to look at in our language and diversity discussion because it's an example of language and diversity taken in the wrong direction and taken in a very destructive way. So a common dictionary definition of race is that it's simply a group of people who are connected because they share the same gene pool. So they trace their descendants along the same path. Another definition of race that it's a really good starting point, and it'll show us the evolution of the definition of the word race, is one that takes us quite far back in time. And race used to be defined in scientific terms as a categorization system for human beings that categorized people according to supposedly universally shared physical and biological features. And so the three main categories were Caucasian, Mongoloid, and Negro. This definition of race has really gone out of style or out of fashion, so to speak, as the science behind it has been eroded. And but it is an interesting definition to look at because it shows us how far this concept of race has changed. This initial definition of race as a categorization system for human beings based on these supposed universally shared characteristics was unfortunately used in very destructive ways by almost every society. It was a definition of race that allowed people in political power and people with social power to categorize people as being more human versus less human. And so if you were in one of the categories of race that was considered less human, this was used as a justification for treating you in a particular way. So this definition of race was really the foundation of a lot of the slavery, well, almost all of the slavery that took place. You know, it was okay to enslave someone if they were categorized in this particular racial group because they were a lesser racial group than in this other category. So this is a really important definition of race, not because it's valid or that it's socially useful. It's an important definition because it really shows us a path that as human beings we don't want to go down. We don't want to start categorizing people as greater human beings versus lesser human beings based on this concept of race. And it's also a really interesting definition because at the time of its use, the scientific community completely got behind this definition, and they looked for ways to scientifically demonstrate that yes, this particular race was superior or inferior in a particular way. So it's a really fascinating definition because it really shows us where we don't want to go when we're dealing with the diversity that is the human race. As our science evolved, so did our definition of race. So race used to be based upon physical characteristics that were very easily seen, such as skin color, eye color, hair color, things like that. But as we increased our understanding of the human species, so too did our definition of race change. So instead of categorizing people by skin color and so on, scientists started to categorize people according to blood type and specific genetic markers. So we still see this partnership, I guess, between the concept of race and the world of science. So as our science evolved, so too did our understanding of what this race concept is and how we could possibly categorize human beings based upon their physical and biological characteristics. And here's a final definition of the word race. We can also define the word race to mean a specific group of people who have been what we call reproductively isolated. So they've only reproduced within that certain small group. And as a result of that reproductive isolation, that group of people shares a very distinct set of genetic characteristics. So this is kind of where the definition of race has kind of moved towards. But it's almost on its way out, as I mentioned previously, because the more we understand the biology and the genetics of the human species, the more we realize that our genetic pool is so similar from one human being to another, and that these physical differences that we see are as a result of a very minute set of our overall genetic pool. So it's a really interesting concept to play around with and to see the history of as we're looking to understand this concept, the bigger concept of diversity. When we do use the word race today, we really detach it from that science that used to go hand in hand with it. So the word race today is used in very general terms simply to indicate a group of people who share a common history, a common language, and a common culture. So it has become completely detached from this science or the pseudoscience that used to support these different categorizations. There's a great video on YouTube called The Story of Race, A History. And this video takes you through the whole history behind this definition of race and how it evolved over time and how it was used in different ways by those with both social and political power. So this video captures this evolution of the concept of race far more succinctly and accurately than I can. So I'm just going to direct you to that video, and you'll see the link for that on your handout. The next term that we're going to define now that we've defined the term race is the term ethnicity. The term ethnicity is a little bit different from the term race because there hasn't been any real attempt to make ethnicity scientific. So there's a whole social and psychological aspect to the term ethnicity. So one way to define the term ethnicity is to consider it to be someone's allegiance to a particular group of people with whom he or she has some kind of historical connection. So it's very much an emotional or psychological allegiance to a group of people. And someone's ethnicity can actually change over time. So a person could consider himself or herself to have one ethnicity at this point in time and another ethnicity at a different point in time. So it's a little bit more fluid, and obviously there's not been this attempt to tie the definition or the term ethnicity to science. We can take the definition of ethnicity a bit further by dividing it into its objective components and its subjective components. So if we're looking at the objective components of ethnicity, this might be someone's physical features, so what they look like, eye color, skin color, eye shape, hair color, and so on. And then it might also be the geographical location someone is located in, and so on. So these are very objective pieces to the definition of ethnicity. And then on the other side, there's a subjective piece, which once again takes ethnicity away from the science that people tried to attach to the term race. So the subjective side of ethnicity is the idea that there are shared beliefs and shared values that go along with belonging to this specific group of people. And the final piece to this idea of ethnicity, or concept of ethnicity, is that it is somehow connected to the past. So ethnicity is a person's connection, both objective and subjective, to his or her past somehow. So through these objective characteristics and also through this subjective feeling of shared beliefs and values, an individual can connect himself or herself to the past by claiming to belong to a particular ethnic group. So there's this past to present connectivity that goes along with the idea of ethnicity as well. There are also two things that ethnicity is not. So ethnicity does not equal minority group, although very often in day-to-day life the two terms are used interchangeably. So just because I belong to an ethnic group doesn't mean I'm necessarily a minority group situated within a majority group. Very often I am, but that's not a direct connection to how we would actually define ethnicity. So you really don't want to use the term ethnicity as a substitute for minority and vice versa. And then the other thing that ethnicity is not a nation or a country. So we wouldn't say that there's a Canadian ethnicity, for example, or an American ethnicity. So don't equate ethnicity to nation, because that's making the concept too big. Okay? So these are two things that ethnicity is not. It's not a minority, and it's also not a substitute word for a country or a nation. I mentioned when I was defining the term ethnicity that it is something that can change over time. And what I mean by that is a person's allegiance or association with a particular ethnicity in his or her mind can change over time. And there's some really interesting situations that arise, particularly today, given that people move around a lot and there's just so much global migration. So we've got people who may initially say, okay, I'm from this ethnic group, and then over time they say, no, I'm from this ethnic group. And then we also get an interesting situation where someone may look like they belong to a particular ethnic group, but they may actually self-identify as belonging to a different ethnic group. So there's a couple of videos that I recommend you look at, and these can illustrate this point much more effectively than I can, to really see this interesting aspect of ethnic identity change over time. So these videos have interviews with people who look one way or look like they belong to one ethnic group but identify with another, and the fun confusion that this creates for them, and also how people's ethnic identities have changed over time. So take a look at these videos. They're really interesting, and there's some great interviews with people who've really thought about this whole issue of ethnicity and their own ethnic identity. So the terms race and ethnicity are really closely tied with this concept of diversity, especially when we're looking at diversity in terms of the group of people that we identify with. As we've seen, the term race, they tried to associate this with concepts of science, and that really didn't work. And so the term race is slowly working its way out of our conversations about diversity. But the term ethnicity is still around because it's very much captures this combination of objective versus subjective identification with a particular group of people. So we will continue to use the term ethnicity when we're looking at the overall concept of diversity. Another term that we need to look at when we're talking about language and diversity is the term stereotyping. The word stereotyping has a really bad reputation, and rightfully so, but it wasn't always the case. The word stereotyping originated as a term to describe what every human being does when he or she encounters other human beings. And so when we encounter other people, particularly people who are different from us, who may appear differently or act differently, what we do is we start to categorize them. It's simply a way of organizing our experiences, because if we didn't organize our experiences with other people, we would just have this big mass of confusion in our brains, and we'd never be able to understand our experiences and predict future experiences. So stereotyping was originally, in its purest definition, simply a process that human beings went through individually in order to organize and categorize the people that they encountered on a daily basis. So if I encountered this particular type of person many, many times, I would start to predict, okay, I think this type of person is going to act in this particular way in this particular situation. So I'm creating a stereotype. And I can create stereotypes about many different categories of people. So I can create stereotypes about lawyers, for example. So maybe I've encountered a lot of lawyers in my life, and so I create a stereotypical lawyer in my brain. And that allows me to sort of predict and then be comfortable with, I'm going to predict how lawyers are going to interact with me based upon my previous experience with lawyers. And I could do the same thing with doctors, with nurses, with actors and actresses, with whatever types of people I interact with on a regular basis. So I'm stereotyping or categorizing those people so that I can predict in my own mind how those people will act in certain situations. This then makes me more comfortable going into different interactions because I have a certain level of certainty about how people are going to interact with me. So we can stereotype based upon the professions or occupations that people have. So I can create my lawyer stereotype and my doctor stereotype and so on. But we can also do the same thing with the different ethnic groups that we encounter or interact with on a daily basis. So I could create, if I interact with a lot of Japanese people, for example, I could create my stereotype of Japanese people. And then this would make me comfortable interacting with Japanese people because I can start to predict how they're going to interact in certain situations. So for example, I know that most Japanese people, when I encounter them, they're going to bow. Okay, that's going to be how we greet each other versus shaking hands, which would be my stereotype of a typical North American. I could also have the stereotype that Japanese people are going to be very comfortable using chopsticks when they eat their meals because that's what they do most of the time when they're eating food. So these are stereotypes that I've made about this particular group of people based upon my encounters with them. And once again, making a stereotype about an ethnic group of people can make me very comfortable interacting with them because I can predict how they're going to behave in specific situations. So in its purest form, stereotyping is just a tool that we use as human beings to categorize our experiences with other human beings who might be different from us. So it sounds very innocent, and in its purest form, it really is. Stereotyping didn't set out to be such a negative concept, but human beings, being human beings, we turn stereotyping into something quite negative. So we started doing three things when we categorize people. And we do this just because we're human. Every human being does this, whether they know it or not. So when we're categorizing people and saying, okay, they fit into this group and they fit into this group, we also unfortunately make judgments about them. So I can put people into this category and I can say, okay, they behave differently and here's how they behave. But then unfortunately I put a negative judgment on how they behave. So I don't remain neutral about those differences. I judge those differences negatively. So this is the first way that we get into trouble when we're stereotyping. We put negative judgments on the things that people in different groups do differently from us. The second way that we get into trouble as human beings when we're stereotyping is that we make those judgments based on a limited piece of information or a limited set of information. So I might categorize people having only encountered that type of person or that ethnicity, for example, one or two times. So, for example, I may have met somebody from Brazil one time and one person, but I may, being a human being, I may make this sweeping generalization and this sweeping stereotype that all Brazilians behave that particular way because I have encountered this one person this one time. So that's me not being very logical. So I am making this stereotype based on a very, very limited set of information. Not really a good or smart thing to be doing. And the final way that we get ourselves into trouble when we're stereotyping, once again because we're human, is that we ignore how individuals may differ from a stereotype. So going back to my example of the Japanese, so I may have encountered hundreds of Japanese people in my lifetime, and I actually have. And so I may have this stereotype of here's how Japanese people generally are going to behave in this particular situation. But then I encounter a Japanese person who doesn't behave that way. So rather than reconsidering my stereotype or acknowledging that this person is an individual, I somehow try and fit that individual into my stereotype. So I'm ignoring how that person or how that individual is different from all of these other individuals from that particular group that I've encountered. So this is another problem that we create for ourselves with stereotyping. We ignore the fact that individuals can be very different from the stereotype that goes along with or that we've created for people from that particular group. Stereotyping, when we add these negative judgments and when we make our judgments based on insufficient information and when we ignore how individuals are different from those groups or categorizations that we've made, this is what creates the problems for stereotyping. So be really careful when you're categorizing people and organizing your experiences. Avoid those negative judgments. Make sure you've actually got enough information to be making the categories that you're making. And finally, don't ignore that individuals do differ from the groups to which they belong. So be really, really careful when you're categorizing people and organizing your experiences. You don't want to get stuck in all these negative things that we do when it comes to stereotyping. Another negative thing that we do as human beings is discrimination. So discrimination is simply making a decision for or against someone based upon the category or the group to which that person belongs. So for example, going back to my example with lawyers, I may discriminate against a lawyer, an individual lawyer, based upon my perception of lawyers as a group. Okay? Or I may discriminate against doctors based upon my understanding or my perception of doctors as a group. So discrimination is making a decision for or against an individual based upon our perception of the group of people to which that individual belongs. Obviously, we've got discrimination based upon ethnic group. So I might make a decision for or against someone based upon the ethnic group to which I think he or she belongs. Okay? I'm not saying this is good, but this is what discrimination is in terms of diversity and ethnicity. So I look at a person and I say, okay, you belong to this ethnic group, therefore I'm going to decide this way or this way based upon the ethnic group to which you belong. Discrimination, fortunately, is now encoded in law in most North American locations where you're not allowed to make really crucial discrimination based upon ethnicity and also based upon age and gender identification and so on. So we've really come a long way when it comes to pushing against or fighting against discrimination because we now have it entrenched in our law that, you know what, when it comes to vital pieces of human existence, we can't make these discriminating decisions based upon a group to which someone does or does not belong. And there's one final term that we need to look at, and this is the term racism. Like discrimination, racism is quite a negative term, and it's something that societies are pushing against and trying to stop and eliminate within social decision making. Racism is a belief that certain races are more superior than others in terms of ability, intellect, and so on. And then we make decisions based upon our belief that those races are superior or inferior. Just as the term race is kind of going out of style, and obviously the science behind race is not supported, the idea of racism is very slowly going out of style, but it's still there. So there are still people that believe, okay, this race is superior in intellect or ability to this particular race. So there's a lot of education and once again legislation being put in place that says, hey, you know, we can't make decisions about someone's ability or intellect or capability based upon the race to which he or she belongs. There's one other piece to racism that is important. And so racism is not just the belief that one particular race or group of people is superior in intellect or ability than another, but it's also acting upon that belief. Okay, so there's this action that goes along with racism. So I believe this, and then I also act upon it, and I make decisions based upon it. And so you'll see this, for example, in history where decisions were made that people of a certain race could not hold political power, for example, because that race didn't have the intellectual capability to rule or to handle that power. So that's an extreme example of racism in action. So racism is both the belief in the superiority of one race over another and acting upon that belief. And thankfully, we're pushing against racism very strongly, and we're seeing the outcomes of this pushback in our societies today. So how do all of these terms that we use when we're talking about diversity, and specifically ethnic diversity, how do they relate to language use? This is where it gets really, really interesting. As individuals, we can make very conscious language use choices based upon the ethnicity or the ethnic group to which we identify. So if I identify with this ethnic group and this ethnic group speaks this language, I'm going to choose to use that particular language because that tells the world, hey, this is the ethnic group to which I believe I belong. That may change over time, and I may decide that, okay, I want to belong to a different ethnic group, and this is the new ethnic group that I want to identify with. So I may actually change my language use based upon that change in ethnic identity that I've given myself. A really interesting area of research is to look at this association between language use and ethnic identity. So people select a particular language to use in a particular situation because they want to be identified with a particular ethnic group that uses that language. So it's really interesting to explore people's language choices in specific situations and how that relates to the particular ethnic identity that they want to project through that particular language use. When it comes to language use and ethnic diversity, there's another term that's interesting to explore, and that's the term ethnolect. So some researchers believe that there are specific languages or language variations that are very strategically and very consciously associated with a particular ethnic group. So people in that ethnic group consciously choose to use this ethnolect or have developed this ethnolect over time as a sign of identity with a particular ethnic group. You may agree or disagree with this idea, but it's still a really fun area to look at. So this is the idea that there are different languages and language variations out there that are very consciously associated with a particular ethnic group. So we've got different types of language variation out there. We've got regional language variation, we've got socioeconomic language variation called a sociolect, and then we've got this idea of ethnic language variation or an ethnolect. And depending upon how you analyze someone's language use, the language they're using may simply be deemed as a regional variation, or it may be deemed as a sociolect, or it may be deemed as an ethnolect. So there's a few, let's take a look at a few examples to kind of illustrate how language variation can be categorized in these different ways. Let's take a look at some of the Creoles from the Caribbean as examples of this debate over whether a language variation is a regional variation, a sociolect, or an ethnolect. So let's take Jamaican Creole for an example. Jamaican Creole could be classified just as a regional variation because it's located in this one particular geographic area. It could be categorized as a sociolect because people in certain socioeconomic classes either use or don't use the Creole. Or it could be classified as an ethnolect because people use it specifically to be identified with a particular ethnic group. Haitian Creole is another example. Is it a regional variation because it's located in this particular area? Is it a socioeconomic variation because people of a certain class speak this Creole? Or is it an ethnolect because people of a specific ethnic group use this Creole? And the lines among these are all gray, and people can argue one way or the other. So there's really no certainty in terms of how these language variations are classified. The fun part is just asking the question. So which is it? And why do you believe it is this particular type of variation? perhaps one of the language variations most debated in terms of regional variation versus socioeconomic variation versus ethnolect variation is African American vernacular English. So there are some people who would argue that it is a variation of English simply associated with a particular socioeconomic class. Other people would argue that no, it's more regional. So in certain regions of the United States, this particular version of English is used. And then other people would argue, no, it's strictly an ethnolect, that it's spoken only by people of African American origin, and it's an identifier of people identifying with that particular group or that particular ethnic group. Once again, there's no real answer here, but it's a really fun, interesting question to ask is how do we classify African American vernacular English? Regional variation, socioeconomic variation, or ethnolect? The jury's out, and I'll just let you make your decisions on that if you want to have some fun and research that a bit more. Canada has an interesting example as well that once again is up for debate, whether it's a regional variation, a socioeconomic variation, or an ethnolect. And these are some of the different varieties of French that exist in Canada. So we've got obviously the large group of French speakers with Quebecois French, but then there's two smaller groups as well of French speakers. There's the Acadiens, which are in certain of the maritime provinces, and then in the prairies there's the Métis. And so the argument is, okay, are these regional variations because Acadien French is found in the Maritimes and Métis French is found in the prairies, or are these ethnic variations, so ethnolects, because people who speak these languages trace themselves back and connect themselves to the past by speaking this particular variation of French, or is there a socioeconomic element to it as well? Once again, this is a fun thing to research. I don't have the answer, but you can try and go find it. In this session on language and diversity, we've really looked at defining key terms when it comes to this connection between language use and language choice and diversity. So we've looked at the terms of race, ethnicity, we've looked at stereotyping, discrimination, and racism, and how all this connects to individual choices when it comes to language use. We've also looked at the term ethnolect as a way to describe a group of people's conscious language choices in order to identify themselves with a particular ethnic group. The lines on all of these concepts are really gray, and there's a lot of debate, and it's actually really interesting debate when it comes to language use and diversity. So I have no clear-cut answers for you on these issues, but hopefully I've just given you some really interesting areas to explore and some interesting questions to ask when it comes to language use and diversity.